Hello my fiery friends, the Infernoman here with our latest gameplay and deck tech video to show you. In this series we highlight a random deck on MTG Arena, and it can range from a spicy homebrew to a tier 1 meta deck that is hot on ranked. And if you do enjoy these videos that we make, all I ask for you is to give a like on this video and subscribe to the channel, as I would greatly appreciate your support. Now, if you like the deck we're playing today, I'll leave a link in the details below so you can give it a spin for yourself on Arena. Keep in mind that these videos will be pure gameplay, no commentary style, so you can enjoy the game. But if you do want to hear my deck tech analysis and thoughts, I'll leave that at the end of the gameplay. So without further ado, let's take the deck that you see right now and get started. And there you have it, everybody. That is our Construct Counter-Strike deck. So this Selesnya build of an artifact-heavy +1/+1 counters deck is actually extremely powerful, as you saw, if your opponent has no answers to it. Now, granted, it is not going to be a budget deck like some of our previous deck techs, but don't worry, do not fear. I actually do have a mono-green +1/+1 counters deck that I did create a couple months ago, so if you're interested in that, I'll be sure to leave a link for that. For those of you who are a little crazy, like I am, and who actually do want to spend the wild cards on this, be sure to check it out right now, because we're going to go deep diving into this deck to show you why it's super powerful, and it's a deck that I think a lot of people right now are sleeping on. So, obviously, if you've seen this before, we were trying to use, of course, hardened scales to try to create a bunch of +1/+1 counters in addition to the ones that come onto our creatures, and just basically, not necessarily double up, but, you know, you're getting an extra one on top of whatever you're adding. However, to back that up, we're also going to use Conclave Mentor to also give us an additional set of +1/+1 counters, and a new card from Brothers War, Yotian Descent. So this Selesnya creature, whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under our control, we get to put another +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So the only reason why we're actually trying to look at this deck again now is because of this specific card. It allows us to then add on counters to whatever we want. But if we have a Conclave Mentor out, if we have a Hardened Scales out, basically we're now giving two +1/+1 counters to whatever we're doing. But what are we building up on? Well, as you kind of saw already, we're just trying to have a bunch of artifact creatures come out and just keep making them bigger and bigger, so big that our opponent just can't deal with them. We are going to be utilizing, of course, Steel Overseer to put +1/+1 counters, tapping it each turn to add them to all of our artifact creatures. A couple copies of Gingerbrute basically just helps us get in some easy, sneaky damage in the early game, but if we can put some counters on it and then keep activating its ability where it cannot be blocked except by creatures with haste, it 9 times out of 10 is just going to get easy damage where it just can't be stopped. However, if you do need to sack it to gain a little bit of extra life to stabilize, don't be afraid to do that as well. Iron Apprentice comes in with a +1/+1 counter on it, but if we have a Hardened Scales, we have a Conclave Mentor, the Apprentice will just automatically come in a little bit bigger and above curve in terms of power. If it does die, we can just move those counters to something else to buff them up. And what's cool about that is, as it does die, remember that the +1/+1 counters that go on, say like the Steel Overseer, will not be just one, but also if you have a Hardened Scales, it'll add on an additional one on top of that. So that means as you're passing it off between an Iron Apprentice to another one of our artifact creatures, you're just going to make it even bigger as it dies. So I guess you could say the joke here is,
if you strike me down, I shall become more powerful than you can possibly imagine.
Sorry, I had to make that Star Wars quote. But in any case, let's continue on and show you that we also are going to be using Hangerback Walker and Stonecoil Serpent as our more flexible options for counters. You can then scale them up accordingly throughout the match, so these are solid options. However, Hangerback Walker, we're only going to have 2 copies because it's a little expensive as we scale up even into the mid and late game. So, however, the good news about this card is you can also put +1/+1 counters on it on its own, so it can make itself stronger if, say, like we don't have Steel Overseer. The other sweet part about this card, of course, is as it dies, it'll create 1/1 Thopter creature tokens for each counter we have on the Walker. So even if the board gets blown up and you have maybe a 5/5 Hangerback Walker, you're just going to get 5 Thopters out of it, which hopefully can still close out the game for us. As far as Stonecoil Serpent, it doesn't really have any way of kind of boosting itself up, but the Serpent's abilities give it reach, trample, and protection from multicolored. Don't underestimate that multicolored ability. It actually can help protect us against quite a few removal spells out there in the format. There is also one awkward thing about this card that I'm going to mention right now. Stonecoil Serpent, because it's protection from multicolored, you can't build it up with the Descent. I realized that after building this, and in hindsight, it's a bit of a flaw, so be aware of that. That's not to say that you should not use them together, but just be aware that if you're trying to build up this Stonecoil Serpent, you're going to have to rely on your other artifact creatures to do that. Otherwise, you have Patchwork Automation. This card is actually a really powerful card that a lot of people underestimate. Its Ward 2 gives it a pseudo amount of protection, and the other biggest thing is whenever we cast an artifact spell, it makes itself bigger. So as we keep casting our other cheap artifacts, it'll keep getting stronger and stronger. And of course, in the 3-drop slot, we have Steel Seraph. I mentioned right now, I know I just said right now, 3-drop slot, because we're mostly going to cast it for the prototype cost instead of the 6 mana cost that it normally runs. However, don't be afraid to then cast it for full price if you're into the mid or late game if you have the mana to afford it. But prototype is perfectly fine on this because it's the abilities we're trying to focus on with this. At the beginning of combat on our turn, target creature we control can gain the choice of Flying, Vigilance, or Lifelink until end of turn. And the sweet thing about that is basically it allows allows one of our creatures to either stabilize with lifelink, maybe we can have vigilance to protect ourselves, we can have Steel Overseer do some damage, but then also tap itself when we need to make other things bigger, or maybe we can make a flyer to go over our opponent's creatures and stop them to close out the game. Now, before we get to the next part of the deck, real quick, if you haven't already noticed, our biggest weakness, of course, is going to be a lot of spot removal and wraths. However, even if we get our entire board blown up with all those +1/+1 counters that get acquired, we have, of course, 2 copies of the Ozolith. So as you've seen this card before, whenever a creature we control leaves the battlefield, keyword here is leave, so even if it gets bounced as opposed to getting destroyed, we can add those counters that it had on it onto the Ozolith, and then we can put them back onto another creature at the beginning of combat on our turn. So even if the board again gets blown up, the Ozolith will save everything and bank it, and then we can just dump it onto our next available creature, hoping that we can just keep the momentum going and prevent our opponent from doing any more harm to us. Even if that doesn't work out and we need to try to destroy our opponent as fast as possible, we will then have 4 copies of Michigo's Reign of Truth. So this 2-mana saga, if you haven't seen it before, basically gives you a +1/+1 until end of turn for each artifact or enchantment we control for 2 whole turns. Then on the 3rd turn, we can exile it and it becomes Portrait of Michigo, which gets +1/+1 for each artifact and or enchantment we control. And of course, we're running a ton of artifacts in this deck, so hopefully we can close out our opponent with just this card if we need to. But no matter how you slice it, the deck still has many ways of getting through, which is why you notice in the main deck we don't really have any protection because we're not too worried about that. Our biggest focus is just to keep building the team up and make them so strong that either our opponent has no choice but to blow up the board and then get punished for it, or we just take them out with creatures that are so big they have no answers to them. As far as your mana base is concerned, it's mostly just going to be every kind of mixture of shock lands, dual lands you can acquire. So as I mentioned earlier, get your pain lands first before you get the pathway lands. Of course, get the shock lands, get a Boseiju Who Endures, and a John Seed of the Empire. Of course, the other thing actually I do want to mention to you is, as far as my only personal opinion for you, is Darksteel Citadel. Lair of the Hydra is basically our backup plan. So in case if everything gets destroyed and we have the mana out for it, we can also just turn on Lair of the Hydra to hopefully close out the game against our opponent. As far as the sideboard is concerned, it's mostly just going to be a little hodgepodge of everything. If you've seen my decks before, if you've seen how I play, I always try to just give you what I would recommend. But as always, my basic thing is keep adjusting your sideboard depending on whatever's going on in the meta if you are a fan of any deck that you play for an extended period of time. Authority of the Consuls are here mostly just to give us some life gain against aggro decks, and of course to slow down those game plans while we take the time to build up our artifact creatures. Portable Hole in the early game just to get rid of something with a mana value of 2 or less. A Haywire Might is actually a new addition, which of course lets us stabilize with 2 life when it dies. However, we can sack it at instant speed to exile a non-creature artifact or non-creature enchantment. That may seem a little too specific, however, don't underestimate the fact that it's at instant speed, so that sometimes can be very critical to not only stabilizing, but also protecting our game plan. Tamiyo Safekeeping, speaking of protection, is also going to be here. Only 2 copies. You're not going to really use these to protect creatures most of the time. The copies are actually here just to protect either our Michigo Reign of Truth, the Hardened Scales, or our Ozolith from getting destroyed and spoiling our game plan. A Pithing Needle is mostly here for the control decks to stop any specific planeswalker we may need to deal with. Unlicensed Hearse is another awesome artifact that also is our graveyard hate, and if we can turn it on and add counters to it, it gets even more powerful. Night of Autumn does seem a little expensive and a little off because it's not part of the game plan per se in terms of artifact creatures. However, it has the flexibility of either destroying an artifact or enchantment. It's not as tight as, say, Haywire Might. You can gain life if you need to, again, stabilize. And it also adds 2 +1/+1 counters on itself, which, if we have Hardened Scales, if we have the Conclave Mentor, makes it even stronger. But the one main reason actually I would recommend this is also because it can destroy any artifact or enchantment when it enters the battlefield if you pick that option. And the reason for that is sometimes it's kind of cute where you can bring in this card and destroy the Hangerback Walker if it has enough counters, and then you can force your opponent to deal with a go-wide strategy with a bunch of Thopters. Just a thought. And then finally, some Yashurn Impeccable Earth. This boar allows us to prevent our opponent from sacking anything. Since our board doesn't really worry about sacking anything, this is a solid option versus a lot of the Rakdos sacrifice decks that are still plaguing the format. Oh, and I forgot to mention actually one final card that I kind of threw in there, not necessarily because it's anything major to us, and it is rather expensive, but I wanted to give it a try. Clay Champion, also from the Brothers War. So this card is really sweet because it's an X and 4 for 2/2. However, when it enters the battlefield, it can get 3 +1/+1 counters for each double force mana we spend to cast it, or for each double planes we spent to cast on the champion, you put a +1/+1 counter on each of 2 target creatures we control. So that does sound like a mouthful, but basically it just helps us synergize with our counter game plan and helps either distribute to help us go big or go tall. Really depends on, again, your game plan. But otherwise, that's all I have for you for carding the deck itself. I highly recommend, if you do want to try this out, don't be afraid to spend the wild cards on it. Yes, it is going to be expensive, but if you do want to make a budget version, one more time, I do have a cheaper version that, again, one more time, I'll throw up on screen so you can enjoy that if you want to play on a budget. But otherwise, I would still say, if you're a fan of decks that go really big with counters, if you do like a different style of artifact style gameplay out there versus some of the current popular stuff, give this deck a try, and I'm sure you will not be disappointed.
That's all I have for you today. Thanks again for watching, everyone, and just remember that no matter what you do play in the game of life, always be sure to burn bright. Later!